All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another Third Place Books virtual author event. My name is Kalani. I am the store manager of our Ravenna location, and I am so pleased to welcome you to this evening's conversation between Anne Liu Kellor and Kristen Millares Young. For those of you who may not know us as Third Place Books or might be viewing from around the country, Third Place Books is an independent bookstore with 3 store locations in the Seattle area. And we very much miss having these author events within the comfortable confines of our bookstores. But we are so thankful to have this virtual platform that brings author events into our own homes and all across the world. So thank you so much for tuning in and supporting independent bookstores. I will be sharing links throughout the chat, throughout this event, where you can buy copies of Heart Radical or Subduction. I'll be sharing these links throughout the event. I want you to please help show your support of our bookstore, help show your support of our authors tonight by making sure to purchase a copy of their books. While you're on our website, our newly redesigned website, I might add, I would love it for you guys to take a look at some of our other events that we have going on throughout the fall. We have a very full lineup. Just to highlight a couple other events that we have going on in the coming weeks. Tomorrow, we are hosting an event for Craig Johnson for the latest release of the best-selling Longmire series. He'll be in conversation with actor A. Martinez. Next Wednesday, we'll be having an event with best-selling authors Miriam Taves and Lydia Kisling. And on October 12th, we have Jonathan Franzen with Maria Semple in conversation for a partnered ticketed event. For reminders about these events and more, I encourage you again to sign up for our email newsletter at thirdplacebooks.com and follow us on our social media channels at Third Place Books. So a quick rundown of the event. I'll be hiding myself, muting myself shortly, and then the whole hour will be Anne and Kristen here. We will be having enough time for audience Q&A questions, so I do encourage you to please use this Q&A function below to ask a question for our authors tonight, and please not the chat. We do encourage you to use that chat, stay engaged with the event tonight. We do see all your comments. I see plenty of conversations going on right now popping up. So yes, we definitely encourage that. We also offer closed captioning for those who are interested. You can hit this live transcript button that's on the bottom of your window to turn this feature on or off. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues might arise. If they do, I will be trying my best to fix it. I'll be behind the screen here this whole time, trying to resolve any issues that might come up. So we do thank you for your patience and understanding. So thank you for sticking with us during this virtual era of author events. It is because of you that this author series is even possible. So thank you again. So without further ado, I will be introducing our authors here. I'm very excited to be introducing them. Tonight, I'm very excited for this discussion between Anne Liu Kellor and Kristen Millares Young. Anne is celebrating the release of her first book, Heart Radical, A Search for Language, Love, and Longing. Anne was born and raised here in Seattle and is a writer, editor, and teacher. She earned her MFA from Antioch University, Los Angeles, and her writing has appeared in the New England Review, Long Reads, Witness, and many other publications. She teaches writing workshops across the Pacific Northwest and loves to support women writers in finding their voice and community. Heart Radical has already received glowing praise from many acclaimed authors, including this one from our good friend, E.J. Koh, who wrote, quote, "Through personal and historical recollection and the language of wounding, Heart Radical speaks to land and culture, selfhood and belonging. To live within and without language, to ignore or embrace silence. This memoir is a refuge, a legacy, a heart breathing in one continuous motion." And as a special treat tonight, Anne is joined in conversation with author Kristen Millares Young. Kristen is the author of the debut novel Subduction. Her essays, investigations, and reviews have appeared in the Washington Post, Literary Hub, The Guardian, and many other publications. From 2018 to 2020, Kristen also served as the prose writer in residence at Hugo House, and she edited the Seattle City of Literature collection Seismic in celebration of Seattle's designation as a UNESCO City of Literature site. So with that, I will be hiding myself and muting my microphone, and please take it away, Anne and Kristen.
Hello. I'm very excited to serve as moderator for the conversation that's going to follow these readings by myself and Anne. And I wanted to, again, encourage all audience members to drop a question into the Q&A little tab there at the bottom, and I'd be definitely going to be weaving those in throughout the conversation, which will begin very soon. I'm going to read an excerpt from an essay called "Every Woman Keeps a Flame Against the Wind." It first appeared in Proximity and was anthologized in a collection called Latina Outsiders, Remaking Latino Identity. And it's about a subject that I began by telling my friends about it. And I kept telling these stories. And I realized that I had a very real need to tell this story, which opens with times of my life where I've been walking along and propositioned without notice, or kind of miscoded for reasons that I discuss throughout. But here's an excerpt midway through. My friends tell me it's the hair, shiny waves long enough to get caught on chairs. Men can't help themselves, they imply. A high school buddy asks why I don't cut it. Women are the only ones who make the suggestion. And I tell them that patriarchy insists that unaccompanied women are for sale. What's more, I refuse to make myself smaller. I take up space unapologetically, and it is this quality, more than anything, which compels judgment. Our society cannot fathom a woman who looks people in the eye. Nowadays, I'm busy looking down, trying to make sure my toddlers don't kill themselves, which is not paranoia. They have a tendency to run toward danger. Then again, so did their mother. I imagine how I'd feel upon hearing my daughter's plan to study sex workers in the communist country I escaped just before geopolitics trapped those remaining without passports. Arrogant as only a college junior could be, I was too focused on making plans to care what my mom thought. I would interview jiniteras. The Cuban slang for a sex worker makes reference to a bicycle, and their johns. I would find academics, policemen, and politicians willing to talk to me. I would film every interview, every street scene. I would conduct this investigation without getting hurt, jailed, or deported. I didn't have a strategy for that. Not really. It was my first experience of journalism, which I understood then as transnational scholarship. In Havana, where my great-grandmother's bones still rest in a cemetery built for nuns and not unwed mothers, I would find out what happened in the lives of women who stayed on the island while the rest of us packed up and left. So let's skip the citations from my Harvard thesis, Jineteras en La Habana, Constructions of Sex Worker Identity, although I once clutched the words it afforded me, magna cum laude, as though they might protect me from being female. What I value has long made me vulnerable in ways that I did not foresee. I spent much of my life accrediting my brain so that I could rise from this body and be seen from my mind. And yet, as a writer, I've learned there is no great wisdom than that of my womanhood. And to think, I almost turned my back on lived experience in favor of a third person I've never met, an omniscience I don't believe in. Our brushes with annihilation are constant and varied and mostly unsung. So let's consider the context. My childhood in the South. JB's Fish Camp had a dive bar feel in a prime location on an inland waterway in Florida. Their motto was Southern seafood with an attitude. Displayed out front was a rough wooden boat, a relic that once belonged to a Cuban refugee. The boat was found empty, contents laid to rest among Spanish galleons and other carcasses of colonial ambition. My father's parents, whom I loved, took me there. I asked to go. I liked the oysters, and manatees would swirl up to the hoses from the docks. But what I most wanted to see was this boat, proof of what my abuela's hard work narrative had always denied, the specter of my desperation and hers. Had mis abuelos not pulled the plug on their lives in Cuba just before revolution exploded from the mountains. To the other patrons of JB's fish camp, the boat was a curiosity, something to gawk at while they hitched their belts and called themselves starving, knowing nothing of that term. Comfort numbs us even to death. And perhaps that is a true aim of capital, to relax into knowing that others are starving, but will be served dinner. As a girl, I learned to listen hard for later. There I stood, hearing sport fishermen debate how to pack a cooler with dry ice without shattering the bottles. But in my mind, I was a bird, hovering above not the one boat, but the many, counting their gleams among the waves, knowing each crest requires a trough. 10 years passed before I walked the streets of La Habana looking for sex workers to interview. Long known as a pearl of the Caribbean, Cuba marketed its women with sequins and crowns of fruit. After the revolution, jineteras were punished with re-education under the hot sun. During the special period in the 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba along with it, Fidel Castro defended a tide of prostitution so thick, it was an undeniable condemnation of his economic failures. Cuba might have prostitutes, he said, but they were the cleanest, healthiest, and most well-educated prostitutes in the world. Talk about advertisement. The men came in droves. It must be known here and now that the vast majority of Cuban women do not sell sex, putting up with all kinds of unequal marketplace exchanges, but not that one. But there were many who made their peace with sex work, and some who fulfilled the sullen hope of their clients by appearing to like it. Maybe they did sometimes. I too have a knack for getting along with strangers. The amiable aggression, the wit that spills over, banking anger before it burns us both. Shallow tales of self-display meant to create connection, but not true vulnerability, not unless I forget myself. Cultivating sources to be returned to again and again. Knowing how the net works. All hallmarks of a good journalist. Deep into careers of diminishing returns, like I am today, sex workers negotiate these terms with much higher stakes. I was their photographic negative, exposed. In my bag, a passport and a bank card and a ticket back to the States. My camera to the side on its tripod formed a triangle that made our horrible mirroring into a kind of symmetry. We are all fractals. Patterns are just a matter of scale. Looking into the challenge of their eyes, I found sex workers to be funny, weary, and wise, having managed the spectrum of humanity with verve. These women sustained a whole economy with their sex. In a country divided by dollar apartheid, jineteras were connectors, each a hub for currency exchanges otherwise out of reach. They bridged that gap with their bodies. The economic benefits of each client were compounded, ferried by ferry members in hired cars to restaurants and hotels that flourished off the books in a country where doctors make $25 a month and filling a gas tank costs multiple of that. Hustlers are the true students of history. When people treat me badly because they think I'm a sex worker, I'm saddened by all that is lost when we presume what any woman is worth. Thank you so much. I know that you're going to enjoy this coming reading from Anne, and I see a question in the Q&A. Thank you so much for that. We'll be sure to be asking it later. So welcome, Anne. I'm so excited for your reading.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you for that reading. And also thank you, Kalani. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Third Place Books. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm trying to keep your presence alive by keeping the participant panel in my line of sight, and just seeing your names is wonderful. Thank you, friends and family. So I am going to start by reading a couple excerpts from Heart Radical. And these excerpts kind of speak to some of my earliest longing and vulnerability that sent me on my journey to China. And they speak, of course, to my mixed race Chinese American identity as well. The first excerpt is from the chapter called Popo. When I was in middle school, after my grandmother no longer lived with us, my mother would call her every Sunday evening at 9. I remember listening to the one-sided drift of my mom's voice talking in Chinese, at some point rising in volume and agitation, sounds that in other families might signify a big fight, but then in our family were the sounds of a typical mother-daughter conversation. After they'd talked for almost an hour, my mom would search for my sister or me, with the outstretched receiver. Who will be the first to say a couple words to Papa? Feet dragging, weighted with anxiety, I would pull myself over to the phone. Papa, ni hao ma? How are you? She'd say a few things. Ni senti hao ma? How's your health? She'd talk for a minute or so. Ha ha. 我不会感冒. Ha. I love you, she'd call out to me at the end in English. Well, ai ni, I'd answer back in Chinese. It was always the same. Reminders from her to wear enough clothes and to not catch a cold. Me struggling to remember how to say the most basic things in Chinese. It only made it worse when Popo would try and say a few words in broken English, signifying to me that my Chinese was really that bad. I dreaded those Sunday night conversations, wished I could be excused for once. Afterwards, I'd often shut the door to my room and lie on my bed and cry. I was ashamed that I could say so little in Chinese. Ever since my grandmother had moved to Los Angeles, where most of my mom's family now lived, I spoke the language less and less. I envied the way my sister managed to remember more than me, and how when we visited Popua in LA, she could dote on her in complimenting coups of Chinese. She was also the thinner one, the more feminine one, the one who wore cute dresses and eyeshadow, the kind of girl old Chinese ladies would love to set up with their grandsons. I was the younger one, the chubbier one, the quiet one who sulked in the background. Only before we were about to leave would I finally sneak upstairs to try and say a few words to my grandmother alone, to tell her I loved her and wished I could say more. And now I'm going to read 2 sections from Mirror Face, which is an earlier chapter. Every woman who lives in a house has a mirror face, a way she examines her reflection, tilts her head, casts her eyes, gauges her own appearance. After putting on makeup or combing her hair, she makes a final assessment of how she appears, or rather, what she thinks she looks like to others before she walks out the door into public. My mirror face took hold in middle school, a time when I became obsessed by how I was seen. Every morning I rushed to the bathroom mirror to see whether my eyes would match or not. The left lid always had a crease in the middle, like a Westerner's eyes, but the right eyelid would sometimes grow puffy and fail to fold on days when I hadn't gotten enough rest. At the time, I did not think of my creaseless eye as looking more Chinese, but I did know it made me look sleepier or uglier. Before long, I figured out that if I held my finger to my lid for several minutes, I could train my eye to fold again as it should. My mom also assured me that a simple surgery could correct this when I got older. I don't remember if this made me feel better, but it did affirm to me that my foldless Chinese eye was indeed a problem. No one in my family wanted me to go to China the first time. Not my mother, not my grandmother, nor the rest of my Chinese relatives. They said the mainland was dangerous, dirty, and backwards. I was 21 and bought my ticket anyway with an open-ended return, thinking I might stay and teach English in Taiwan, where one of my uncles still lived. But first I would travel in China with no real plan except to head west. It felt amazing to speak Chinese again. So much started flooding back to me, so much vocabulary, but most of all the feeling of living and breathing inside this language. This language I spoke as a child, but less and less as an adult. I proudly took the lead at times with other travelers, ordering up big feasts in restaurants with no menus, buying bus tickets, or negotiating rides. I loved to impress the locals with my good pronunciation. 你是哪里人? Where are you from? People would ask, confused by my Western features, yet Chinese resemblance, and the fluent tones coming out of my mouth. I'm American, I'd explain, knowing they equate American with white, but my mother is Chinese. Ah, 怪不得, they'd say, eyes lighting in comprehension. 混血, mixed blood. I'd go on to explain how my mom was born in Chongqing, but grew up in Taiwan, and their eyes would shift slightly. Ah, one of those. Yet still, I felt welcomed into their fold. And on the morning when I woke and realized that I'd actually been dreaming in Chinese, I knew I'd finally re-inhabited a part of myself that I hadn't even realized I'd lost. This first trip was only the beginning. I knew I had to come back. And I'm going to read one last little part from the same chapter. Race and ethnicity, of course, were only part of my evolving identity. Practiced at the art of obsessively combing my hair and checking myself out in the mirror since I was young. By college, I was all too aware of how men watched me while walking down the streets or halls, and by the way my face and body seemed to be my greatest assets. Self-consciousness and a desire to please others had shadowed me for years. Who liked me, how I sounded, how I was seen. I barely spoke in class and had to force myself to participate, even a tiny bit. How much of this had to do with gender and how much had to do with race? That wasn't a question I knew how to ask back then. All I knew was once I was away from home, apart from my tight circle of high school friends, I became painfully aware of how afraid I was of speaking out in a group, whether sitting in class or around a crowded cafeteria table. Something shifted for me, however, the summer after my freshman year, when my old friend Beth and I went to Alaska to work in a cannery in Bristol Bay. Here, we wandered the beach during the slow periods or worked 18-hour shifts during peak. Mostly, we worked the night shift in the frozen section, tossing, sorting, bagging, and weighing huge rock-solid salmon for hours at a time. But most significant to me was that for the first time in 8 years, I didn't wear eyeliner, a ritual I'd adopted since I was 11, never going out without it. I'd learned it from my sister, who was a year and a half older, a dark, thin line painted near the lashes with a little brush dipped first in water and then in the black cake of makeup, all of which was stored in a rectangular silver box. The only problem, however, was when my right eye would fail to fold properly, I could no longer apply makeup on that eye in the same way. Instead, I needed to draw the line in the middle of my eye so the line could be seen, like my mother did with her eyeliner. "You messed up your makeup," a boy I liked said to me one day in class. I can't remember my reply, just my shame, unable to tell him that I'd drawn it that way on purpose. I'm gonna stop there.
The casual commentary, the patriarchy happens so soon in a woman's life. You don't know what it is when it first arrives, right? It's stunning how those small things lead to such large inquiries.
Indeed, yeah.
So I really appreciate some of the questions that we're getting in the chat and the Q&A. Although I am going to keep our discussion today focused on Anne, because I'm just so excited about Heart Radical that I want to make sure that I have time to ask these questions I've lovingly crafted for you. And I know that, being biracial can feel like a koan in a nation like ours that favors monolithic identities. So I'm curious about how the writing of this book and the explorations that it depicts, of your interior landscapes and the exterior landscapes of your family history and diaspora, what it taught you about holding space for who you are, and how you might share that with most people in our audience tonight.
That's such a good question. Such a big question, because I feel like paradox informs so much of my life. Although, of course, when I was 20-something, I wouldn't have been able to name that or even know what paradox is, perhaps. I feel like through so much of the writing that I've done, I have come to see how growing up bilingual and growing up mixed race have given me this sense of both not quite belonging in spaces, but also knowing multiple ways of belonging, knowing myself in multiple contexts, and also traveling busted that open for me, because of course, when we're younger, we have these narrow friend groups and sense of who we are. And I wanted to break free of that, but I didn't even quite know what it was I wanted to break free of self-consciousness and judgment. I wanted to know how to be present in my body, with my mind, and with my thoughts. And I wanted to be able to speak my mind and speak spontaneously. But instead, I was so quiet and so afraid of being judged, of having something come out wrong. And so really it was this process of writing over decades, which I've always loved to write, but especially I started writing more while I was in China, and then eventually came to call myself a writer and know that I was writing a book. It was through this process that I slowly, very slowly over time, came to trust my voice, came to trust my intuition, trust in what I knew, trust in the spontaneity of each thought and word arising on the page, that I didn't have to show or prove to anyone. It could just be for me. And I think because the book had such a long gestation period, and also, conversely too, like I have had such a long gestation period in, for so many years, I felt like my community was not very large and not a lot of people fully saw me, and I didn't even fully know or see myself, right? So I was very cloistered for a long time, but it was paradoxically through that gestation period that I came to trust in my voice and just in the value of writing for writing's sake, before I ever began to share my work more widely. So
that's one thing that I loved about your book, is that it shows you doing that work and you leave that journey on the page. And I really appreciated that, because it takes a lot of courage to show yourself in a state of incomplete knowledge, especially when you have reached such hard-won wisdom along the way. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about Heart Radical, is the way that you did not dissolve that pathway. And in so doing, you allowed other people to travel it as well. But when we were talking earlier about your editorial choices with Heart Radical and that long gestation period, you told me that you revised the book into the present tense after a lot of consideration, and that affords a lot of opportunities and also forecloses others. So why did you make that choice?
Yeah, so originally, as the book evolved, it first began as a series of standalone pieces, right? And then eventually so many of the pieces were focused on this journey, and it was such a narrative classic journey that it made sense to just fill in some of the gaps and make it more of a memoir with a traditional arc. But that sounds easy, but that was actually so hard, especially for emerging newer writer, to figure out how to create that seamless connection between chapters and between voices, because I was also experimenting a lot with point of view, with present and past tense. And some chapters were more narrative and some were more lyrical. But I think the biggest challenge was that because I was working on it over such a long period of time, that of course my perspective kept changing and deepening, and then the ending kept expanding. Like, where do you end the book? Because I was still only a few years out from what I was writing about. And so life keeps evolving and I keep learning more about all these layers of myself, whether it was writing about, language learning, or my spiritual path, or my romantic path. So there were all these decisions to make, but I think what it came down to was that the chapters that felt most alive were the ones that were in present tense. And a lot of the other ones were getting bogged down in too much reflection. And it was a lot of, I think I was still too close to it to be able to properly reflect. So I leaned into changing it all to present tense, because that automatically, forced me to cut any reflection that wouldn't feel natural, as if I was having it there in that scene, in that moment. And it also kind of helped me freeze the perspective in time, and you know, it restricted me from being able to keep changing it, right? So it preserved the younger voice, the younger perspective of myself who had returned from China. But then, of course, I also wrote some other reflective chapters that are almost all in past tense and more essay-like. Other lyrical chapters, I wrote those, I wove those in to give the memoir the necessary reflection that memoir also needs. So what we have is like this hybrid of like who I was then, and then a little bit of, you know, who I am now inserted in places. And obviously, you know, it's a craft, it's a crafted perspective, right? It's over time, the writing becomes more in service of the artifact and of the art, rather than trying to preserve the exact person that I was then.
You know, Anne Rhoda asked if there was a thread that you found that helped pull all the experiences in Heart Radical together. I can think of a few. You did just name a few, but I was wondering if you could explore how you found that while moving through all this material that you had already generated and going in the revision process.
Yeah, that is a great question. And that was one of my challenges, right? Because there were several threads. And I also really struggled with the spiritual thread and how to really convey the depth of my spiritual awakening and who I was at the time that I was traveling, and how that shifted. But the way I found to tie it all together, really, I think it crystallized around silence and voice. And you know, finding my voice as a woman, but also the theme of language and being bilingual. But beneath that, you know, just the essential theme of needing to speak my mind to myself, needing to own what I know in my body, needing to follow my heart, which is such an essential theme in so much work, right? It's so universal.
Taking ownership of what you know in your body is a process that takes decades, right? Not to push away for capitalist production reasons the wisdoms and whispers of the body. It's a beautiful yield for any reading to get to that. But I hear a lot of what you're saying, and I know that it comes out in your teaching as well. So I was curious about how your path to publication influenced your teaching style.
Yeah. So my teaching style has always been really rooted in doing a lot of free writing with my students, being a co-participant, modeling vulnerability, trying to create a space where people feel safe to share, people feel heard, people feel seen. And that's also, you know, that was a mirror of my own practice, and really valuing journaling, free writing, trusting in where prompts and where, you know, where that will take you. And also just being patient, right? So although I didn't set out to be the teacher that could say to their students, you know, it might take you 20 years, but you can do it. I you know, that was both really hard, and not that, you know, I will say 20 years is like the span of when the early seeds of the writing were planted. And then, of course, when I published it, and in between there was periods where I worked on other stuff and shelved it. But I think being able to, being forced to continue to lean into, why do I do this? You know, why would I write even if this never gets published? Why do I still need to do it? What is the practice and process of writing? How does it feed me? Learning to trust in that over decades influenced how I was able to teach that, offer that to my students, because of course no one wants to hear that it can take that long, or that, that no one wants to hear about the true challenges of the publishing industry. And I think, again, like back to Paradox, like we can find that space in between where we can understand why we want to learn craft and why we want to create something that we can share with others, and that how it can be received by others. And we can also know why just the process of it feeds us, and why, we'll keep doing that even if we're not going to share our work with more than a few people.
Of course, along that way, part of who you're sharing your work with is your teachers. So Patty Lavelle wanted to know if there are any elementary, middle school, high school, or college. I'm interested in also outside of the academy teachers that helped you on that path.
Oh, there's so many teachers. Like in third grade, no, was it second grade? I had a teacher, Ms. Pruzan, and she was the one that introduced me to writing poetry. And she also would write letters with this fancy calligraphy and send them to me, I think, in the summertime. But I had amazing elementary school teachers all throughout who saw that spark of the writer in me and nurtured that. I had a high school teacher, creative writing teacher, Mr. Levinson, and I just remember, he encouraged me to consider writing as a path, or he asked, have you considered it? And I remember saying, well, not as a career, because that was the message I'd internalized, of course, from society and my parents. And I just remember he said, why not? And those two simple words, why not, stuck with me. Yeah. And then I've had many, many wonderful teachers, but too many to name right now.
20 years is a long time. In the process, you met and a man, you began a family, you are a mother now. How did you know how to bring Heart Radical to a conclusion, like where to end?
I mean, ending it shortly after my return to China felt logical in a way, in this narrative arc kind of way. I did write other chapters that didn't make the cut, that, like one that was about my reintegration into America and reflecting more on race in America. All kinds of writing that I didn't end up putting in there, and that I eventually just realized this writing can go on into other essays, right? I can't possibly say what I need to say with this one book. We all have our obsessions that we come back to and write about again and again in new forms. And I think, and part of being a teacher and through writing practice has helped me realize that, right? So I think that gave me some reprieve, in trusting that, like, all these chapters, all these fragments, they're not wasted, right? They're feeding into other work. And I will continue to write about the same themes in new ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to fight as well the recurrence of thematic inquiries in my work, whether it be investigative journalism or essays or fiction. And then I realized that the mind returns for a reason to these questions. And in that recurrence, each time you cycle back into that place of unknowing to knowing, it reveals something more about what it means to be human and what it is that we are here to do. So the recurrence is necessary to actually accumulate wisdom.
Yeah. It's like those obsessions, those thematic repetitions, that's your gift, right? It's like we can't possibly all write about everything. Like, we have to hone in on what it is that we're most intimate with, that's driving the most intimate questions and longing in our own life, right? So yeah.
I wanted to, Sarah Rutherford Bundy asked a question about my novel, about what prompted me to tell a story that was based on the Makah Indian Reservation. And for me, part of it was moving to this region and finding that the indigenous presence here is so strong, so necessarily vital to the political process, that it upended what I had been taught about my own family's immigrant narrative, which is always, for many immigrants, even if there is prejudice from outside of the immigrant community, the story that we often tell ourselves is hard work, sacrifice, making it. There's possibilities for that in this nation, which is so voracious and forgetful, right? And yet every immigrant to this land becomes a settler upon arrival, and finding a way to spend years reflecting on what that would mean for my own production as a writer and a reporter, for the ways that I would invite others into the space of seeing themselves as part of this literary community, and opening spaces within the literary community to recognize the storytelling that has been happening here for millennia. And all of those things do take years. They do take recurrence. So I'm really curious and excited about what you're going to be working on next. And I know you have a couple of books in the wings. What you got?
Yeah. So I have a collection of essays that is more or less done, although of course I could keep adding to it. It's called, what is it called? Uncertainty, Trust, and the Present Moment, Essays from In Between. And some, like I said, it's an outgrowth of themes from my memoir. So also looking at intergenerational inheritance, looking at impermanence and suffering, and then looking inside at the ways in which I can both be incredibly generous and incredibly selfish, and where those impulses come from and butt up against each other in all of us, really, and how that arises from fear. And then I have another memoir. It's another intergenerational memoir called Artifacts of Longing, which I've also worked on for a decade or more, that's been on hold. And it is about actually inheriting this house that I live in from my old neighbor. And he was a merchant marine, and his wife was an artist and an activist. And so originally I thought this book is going to be about my relationship to them and their life as I combed through maybe thousands. I can't remember, it's been so long. Hundreds of letters between them when he was at sea for most of their marriage, and as well as so many artifacts, which including a lot of native artifacts that they collected when they stole when they sailed up the Inside Passage every summer. So they have this really fascinating story. But the longer that I lived in this cabin and started to live out my life here with my now ex-husband and my child, the more I started writing about our life here and writing about these two strands of marriage, gender roles, communication, as well as, again, these themes of selfishness and generosity. So
that sounds fascinating.
Excited about that one. Yeah.
I'm like, wait, you inhedited a house from your neighbor?
Yeah.
What? That bucks a Seattle trend, right?
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I can't wait to. So Artifacts of Longing.
Artifacts of Longing.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I really appreciate about all of these works is that they are the product of a deep reflection. And in Heart Radical, you show yourself writing in your journal. And I really felt connected to those moments because I've always often throughout my life used the journal as a portal into gaining greater clarity on my life and my emotional state. And trying to, how to be in the world.
Mhm.
But I was so curious about how you moved from journal to memoir or journal to essay collection,
Mhm.
and as both research and then craft practice.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the benefits of journaling a lot, and I don't journal quite as much now because I don't have as much time, but I used to journal, a notebook a month, and sometimes I still do. So one of the benefits of that is just having so much source material to return to look at the small details of my life and what's happening around me, or even choice lines of dialogue, right? So that's how I was able to remember so much detail and write with so much detail about my time in China. And of course, some pieces just originate from that free writing in the journal. Sometimes it's like a line or an image or something that's just so striking that it inspires the beginning of a piece. And other times it's more like going back to source material and trying to remember who I was in this period and trying to use that as a tool of reflection to look back over the minutia and see what are the patterns unfolding and how was I interpreting things at the time and versus how do I see them now.
Well, we have, in our audience, we have such excellent writers who are also authors of memoir. Carol Smith is here, and she wrote Crossing the River, 7 Stories That Saved My Life, which is such a beautiful book. So I want to encourage those who are in the audience to please, ask your questions. We have about 15 minutes left of our time together, and I want to make sure that I hold space for the curiosities that you may have. And Third Place would like you to put it in the Q&A, but you can drop it in the chat. I'll see it either way if you have a hard time finding one of the boxes. But how did you generate the mindfulness needed to make the cuts to a manuscript after spending so much time on chapters, for example, that either weren't published in that book or may not be published? How did you generate that clarity?
I think just time, right? Over time, you just have it. Sometimes, you can have a good editor or a good writing group that can help you make the cut faster and see faster what needs to go. And sometimes it just takes time to realize, and again, to then ultimately be crafting in the service of this artifact, of this work of art, instead of trying to document everything because this happened, it needs to be in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also knowing that this other material can still live and breathe in other ways. And sometimes maybe it takes writing a whole essay to get to that seed nugget of wisdom. And maybe that is the only line that survives in some, kind of crafted form, but it was still worth it. For example, there was so much backstory, like my whole first trip to China that I tried to write about, include, but it just weighed down the beginning of the manuscript too much in this other way that wasn't working. And so I cut all of that, but through writing pages and pages and pages of that, it helped me get to those key lines of reflection where I could clearly name, this is what was happening for me when I was younger, right? Or this is what motivated me to go on the second trip. So patience, time, I had a lot more of it in my 20s and 30 or before motherhood to do that. Now my working habits are a little different. But I still hold that space for like the practice, right? And just knowing that it's not all about the product. It's so much more about what the practice yields, what the process yields.
Yeah, I like you, I try to parcel out my wisdom to my students and mentees it's almost like counseling a woman who hasn't yet had a child. You don't need to laden them with all the things that are happening later. You can take each stage as it comes, because to hear and really understand the journey is the reward.
Yeah.
Can be a very defeating thing, considering how painful and arduous that journey toward publication can be. So I am grateful for your ruthlessness in revision. One of our participants would like to know, what was the most surprising thing that you learned or that you experienced while living and traveling in China?
Such a good question. Surprising things. Honestly, I don't know if this is totally surprising, but really it was learning my weakness. It was learning how permeable I felt out on these crowded, polluted streets, how much I took everything in. This isn't necessarily a weakness, but how sensitive I was, an empath. I didn't have that word then. How much I needed nature and space around me, how much I needed my close friends and people to confide in, how much I needed and had taken for granted so many things, right? Like before I left, I didn't think I had much community, but when I was there, I realized, wow, that I did actually have spaces that I could express myself creatively in. People that I could share my writing with, all these things. So I felt despite having this loving relationship while I was there, I felt very isolated and really, quite unhappy towards the end. And I had to shed a lot of these grand ideas I had about my purpose and what the trip was going to be and how I was going to help people. I wanted to go in and be a teacher, or I wanted to help somehow see how I could be a translator and help the Tibetan cause and all these grand ideas. But I realized there's a lot I need to work on in myself. And I love this idea of the spiral, both as a narrative structure, but also in life, where it can, with every rotation, it can appear as if you are moving backwards at times, or you're covering the same terrain, but really sometimes that's just the process of needing to go inward, reconnect to source, reconnect to roots, reconnect, instill that vitality and that power before then being able to circle back around and be more outward. So I was reminded of that metaphor today by the writer Mindy Natifi. But anyway, so that's I don't know if we have time to go into narrative structures, but that's also something that I realized, my life, most people's lives do not actually follow the traditional narrative arc of like huge journey, challenges, success, and then everything's great, right? It's always these cycles of learning that help us go deeper into these core lessons we're learning in our lives, and also the core then gifts that we have to offer people.
I'm really grateful to hear you say that, because I have really moved off of the 3-act structure as a narrative underpinning of my creative writing teaching. Because, and it's interesting, I've been feeling this way for a long time. And then I read in Ursula Le Guin's book, Steering the Craft, she wrote that predicating conflict as a narrative spine, which is the narrative spine of the 3-act structure, is to prioritize the worst aspects of our culture. And there are so many other ways of bringing connection and knowing and action into a story that do not need to foment everything as a response to conflict. And I think that your cyclical or spiral structure, Ocean Vuong writes beautifully about creating different kinds of temporal structures within On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. So I think there's a lot of decolonizing that's happening of narrative structure and not allowing Chekhov to kind of write the script for everyone who's going to come after. And one of the ways that we can do that, of course, is to experiment with different forms. So one of the wonderful writers who is in attendance this evening, someone who writes in many genres herself, Donna Miskolta, asks, so Kristen writes fiction and essays. Anne, do you see yourself writing any fiction in the future? And can you talk about what drives you to write nonfiction memoir rather than other forms?
Yeah. I've always wondered if someday I would be able to write fiction. For some reason, it feels like I would have to have way more time and spaciousness and have, completed all of these other nonfiction works that I want to write. So I don't know if I will ultimately get there unless I end up fictionalizing my next memoir, perhaps, so that I can take more, creative stretching with it. But there's something about nonfiction that's always called to me. I love fiction too. I do read it, but when I read a memoir, there's something about the intimacy of knowing that the author is, sharing their truth and story as close as possible to what happened, that makes me pay closer attention, and that makes me, feels like there's more at stake somehow. It just feels like I and our culture, I too, are hungry for that kind of intimacy with other people, and that kind of vulnerability, and letting ourselves be seen, and seeing ourselves in other stories. So I feel like for me, that transmutation is more direct when I'm writing and reading memoir. But I know that can happen in other genres as well. If anything, I feel myself more drawn towards poetry, and my writing keeps getting denser. And so that's more of the direction I'm headed.
Poets make the best essayists, I always think.
I know, and the best memoirists, right?
Yeah, it's true. It's true. So I would like to conclude with an excellent question from Joyce Chen, co-founder of Seventh Wave Magazine, an editor and a writer of essays herself. Before I ask this question, I want to encourage audience members. Anne has signed copies of Heart Radical available at Third Place Books. And I'm telling you that they've actually been selling out repeatedly, and she's had to go back to the store several times to sign them. So if you want a signed copy, please look through the chat for the link to her book, Heart Radical. And I'm sure that she will deputize you to do that as she answers Joyce's question, which is so good. And I love this idea of circularity and cycles as a more, dare I say, honest way of depicting how we experience life. What are some, if any, things that have come full circle since you began planting the seeds for this book?
Ooh, Joyce with the good question to end with. Oh, gosh. Okay. So I, right before this book was published, so 2 years ago now, or so right before I signed the contract, essentially, I got a divorce. And that's another story. That's part of Artifacts of Longing, perhaps. But there was something that felt very full circle about coming back to my solitude and coming back to this grappling with being alone in the world, ultimately, and fear and risk, and needing to just take this leap of faith in the same way that I did in my 20s, and claim my voice and reclaim this path for myself, and now do it without having to, consult with someone else about decisions. All of that felt very full circle. And I think there was something about, I would never have chosen for it to take this long for the book to come out into the world. And I don't necessarily believe everything happens for a reason in such a linear way. But I do feel like there was something about going through this painful process of divorce that forced me to reclaim my strength and my voice in a way that has helped me reconnect to the vulnerability and the strength that I harnessed in my 20s to go on this journey from this deeper, wiser place that's helping me now to talk about the book and to put it out into the world, which is its own journey. I've learned just as much, if not a lot more, from the long process to publish the book and now to share it with the world than I did, in those years in China, which were so formative, but now so long ago. So there's something about the timing that feels right, for sure.
I love that the book became a teacher for you as well.
Yeah.
So that is a gift. Kalani, who is our excellent host, dropped a link one more time to Heart Radical. I recommend that you get that now, and because we are about to wrap up this excellent conversation. The last question I would ask you, Anne, is when is your next event?
Actually, I have 2 events. I'm looking in my book for the next on my calendar. I have on October 9th, I'm doing a reading hosted by Village Books with Brenda Miller, and she was my mentor in graduate school. I haven't seen her in years and years, so that feels full circle to get to read with her, and she's inspired so much of my learning around craft, and she's a wonderful writer. And 2 days prior to that, October 7th, I'm part of a group reading with Coffee and Grief. There's a Facebook group called Coffee and Grief run by Anne Gudger, based in Portland. And it's the sweetest writing series. It's so welcoming to new writers. If any of you want to read there, you would just, drop me a line, drop Anne a line. It's really welcoming. And this is like this sweet community. So yeah, those 2 things. You can find them on my website.
Nice.
Yeah.
2 days after your second reading, I have a reading hosted by Skylight Books, also featuring Erica Worth, author of Buckskin Cocaine and Crazy Horse's Girlfriend, and Savannah Johnston, author of Rights. I would highly recommend folks to sign up for the Third Place book newsletter because they have a wonderful lineup coming up. And I just want to say thank you all for being here. I see that Ruth Tycrope, someone that I was an investigative reporter with at the Seattle PI and a novelist and memoirist herself, is in attendance. Sarah Nielsen, who covered this book beautifully for the Seattle Times and had an excellent essay in Catapult recently. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who came, and to you, Anne, and to you, Kalani, from Third Place for hosting. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm rapidly trying to read the chat. Maybe you can save it for me, Kalani.
Yeah, definitely. I will save that. There's been some great comments coming through here. I love Sarah's comment there, just about feeling so inspired by your guys' conversation. I love that we were able to really kind of get into some questions about craft. I love the image of like the narrative spiral. I've been thinking about that, and absolutely great conversation. I'll try and save the chat right now. I'll also be saving this event so it can be replayable on our YouTube channel. We have been posting some of our virtual events on that YouTube channel, so this can be rewatched again. But again, thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you so much, Anne. We do have copies of Heart Radical available in our store. Copies available on our website there. I've been sharing the link. I got my copy. I've started it. I'm about 20 pages in. Thank you to She Writes Press for sending me a copy as well. I'm going to log us off. I'll let Kristen and Anne say the final word again, but appreciate you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Kalani.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.